Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to call on our colleagues in the Senate to swiftly pass H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, and H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks Act. These bills are bipartisan, common-sense solutions to our nation's gun violence crisis. Together, they accomplish what the vast majority of Americans want: to keep guns out of the wrong hands. I was proud to co-sponsor both bills and vote for them when they passed the House last week. Now it's time for the Senate to take action. In 2020, the Gun Violence Archive reported more than 40,000 deaths caused by gun violence, including over 1,300 children. And yet, despite the fact that gun violence continues to rise and that 90% of Americans, including 80% of gun owners, support universal background checks, Republicans in Congress have spent years blocking bipartisan legislation to close our biggest loopholes and keep our community safe. Gun violence is preventable, and yet it's such a tragically routine occurrence in this country that every community has a story. Mine is no exception. I recently joined the Aurora Historical Society in Illinois to pay tribute to the 5 people murdered and the 7 heroic first responders who were injured 2 years ago during a shooting at the Henry Pratt Company. The mayor of Aurora, Richard Irvin, said after the shooting that, quote, "We as a society cannot allow these horrific acts to become commonplace," end quote. And yet, absurdly, we've already reached a point where this unspeakable tragedy in Illinois is not even America's most lethal mass shooting in a town named Aurora. So I call on my colleagues in the Senate to take action with us so that our children can someday live in a country in which gun violence is no longer commonplace. As a nurse, I'm thrilled that in 2019, we finally directed federal funding towards public health research on gun violence for the first time in 2 decades. This type of research is critical for evidence-based policymaking, and I will keep fighting to make sure that that funding continues. But studying the problem is just a first step in our work to solve it. It's already past time to make simple changes that we already know work. Background checks are a simple, effective way to keep guns out of the wrong hands. A 1995 Connecticut law requiring background checks for firearm purchases was associated with a 40% decline in gun homicides and a 15% drop in gun suicides. Meanwhile, when Missouri repealed a similar law in 2007, gun homicides jumped by 23%, while firearm suicides rose by 16%. Homicides and suicides by other means stayed flat in both states. Only gun violence changed. I wish all our public health crises had such a clear, straightforward solution. H.R. 8 would require a life-saving background check for every gun sale, while H.R. 1446 would give the FBI more time to complete those checks before a single sale goes through. These bills would not add any new restrictions on who can buy a gun or what kind of gun that they can have. Rather, it would make it easier to enforce our existing gun laws and stop guns from being sold to people who are already prohibited from owning one. I'm not willing to wait for the next murderer to attack the next church in the next Charleston. I'm not willing to wait for the next angry employee to murder his coworkers at the next Henry Pratt in the next Aurora, Illinois. I'm not willing to wait for the next Aurora, Colorado, or the next Pulse nightclub, or the next Parkland, or the next Tree of Life, or the next Sandy Hook. I am also not willing to wait for more women to be murdered by their abusers, or for more children to be lost to gun violence. I am done waiting. My constituents are done waiting. Enough is enough. Americans deserve to feel safe in their schools, in their houses of worship, in their movie theaters, in their workplaces, and in their homes. We can no longer live in a country where any building can so easily become a battlefield. My colleagues and I in the House voted last week for a safer future for our children. And now I call on my colleagues in the Senate to save lives and send H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446 to the President's desk. I yield back.